Apology for Poetry. An Apology for Poetry is a critical work written by the prominent Elizabethan poet and courtier Sir Philip Sidney in the late 16th century. It was not meant to be a literal apology in the modern sense, but rather a defense of poetry as a valuable and noble form of literature. In Sidney's time, poetry was often criticized for being frivolous, untruthful, and lacking moral value. An apology for poetry aimed to counter these criticisms and establish the importance of poetry as a means of moral instruction, entertainment, and communication of truth. Sidney believed that poetry had the power to inspire virtuous behavior and noble actions. He argued that poetry could instill a love for learning, shape character, and move readers to emulate the virtues presented within the poetic works. Sidney emphasized the imaginative and emotional impact of poetry. He argued that poetry had the ability to transport readers to different worlds, elicit strong emotions, and create empathy. Through the use of vivid imagery, figurative language, and captivating narratives, poetry could stir the soul and offer a unique aesthetic experience. According to Sidney, poetry was a form of imitation, imitating not the flowed world but the divine creation itself. He believed that poets, through their art, could capture the essence of nature and reveal truths that often eluded other forms of literature or even philosophy. One of the significant aspects of An Apology for Poetry was Sidney's response to Plato's criticism of poetry. Plato viewed poetry as an imitation of an imitation, a mere copy of the imperfect physical world. Sidney, however, argued that poetry, through its creative power and ability to evoke emotions, had the potential to surpass mere imitation and capture deeper truths. Sidney presents the ideal poet as someone who possesses a combination of moral virtue, knowledge, and creativity. He believed that a poet should be well versed in various disciplines, including history, philosophy, and science. This broad knowledge base enables the poet to draw upon a vast array of subjects and themes, enriching their poetic creations with depth and substance. Sidney viewed poetry as a potent educational tool. He argued that poets could convey moral lessons and ethical values to readers more effectively than straightforward philosophical treatises. Through their imaginative storytelling and engaging language, poets could captivate the audience's attention and make the lessons more memorable and impactful. Sidney classified poetry into three categories: divine or religious poetry, philosophical or didactic poetry, and imaginative or fictional poetry. He saw divine poetry as a highest form because it's directly dealt with spiritual and divine matters. Philosophical poetry aimed to educate and instruct, while imaginative poetry allowed for creativity and the portrayal of various emotions and human experiences. During Sidney's time, Puritans criticized poetry and theatre for their alleged immorality and frivolity. In response, Sidney emphasized that it wasn't poetry itself that was at fault, but rather the misuse of it by some poets. He believed that well crafted poetry could elevate the soul and encourage virtuous behavior. Sidney argued that poetry had advantages over history as a medium for recording events. While history aimed to represent events as they happened, poetry could go beyond mere facts to capture deeper truths and underlying motives. The poet's creative license allowed them to explore the emotional and psychological aspects of historical events, making them more relatable and emotionally resonant to the readers. Another important aspect of An Apology for Poetry is Sidney's critique of overly rigid rules and restrictions imposed by certain critics and theorists of his time. He believed that poets should have the freedom to experiment and innovate, allowing their creative instincts to flourish without being bound by arbitrary conventions.